to you guys, of course, you're going to work your asses off regardless, but there are going to be, of course, people that jump aboard when they know, like, oh my God, like there's probably people out there that knew Taylor Swift before she was Taylor Swift. Mm-hmm. And then there's people that now just listen to Taylor Swift and be like, I really like Taylor Swift stuff now. And it's like, okay, have you heard of Bad Blood or 22? They're like, no, now. I'm like, all right, like relax. Like I wasn't going after you.
Like, you're not a real fan because you have Fearless and Red and like.
Welcome to Tobin Tonight, Mallory. How are things? How are you? I like that we're kind of both in a bedroom setting, although yours is way better because if I move, I have Toronto.
I love it. I actually lived in Toronto for a year, so I'm okay with having Toronto in the background. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this. I've been watching a few of them, so they seem super fun. And I'm doing good. I'm officially out of quarantine. I got out of quarantine a couple days ago from international travel, so I am ready to socialize.
See, if we had the money or the bank account of a John Oliver, we would have had this rigged where like balloons fall down and everything.
I know.
Yeah. But I do like that you mentioned about living in Toronto for a year because I actually lived in Ottawa going to Carleton. And to me, someone would be like, well, how did you manage a Toronto background or a Toronto setup? I'm like, man, it's Newfoundland. Like you're either Toronto or Montreal. It's passed down from either your grandfather or your father. Like
it's true.
I feel like we're going to be the generation that there is a few Ottawa fans. It's like, how'd you become an Ottawa fan? It's like, oh, my dad. I'm like, how old's your dad? It's like, well, he's 60 now. And I'm like, okay, he was born in like the 1990s. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, okay, that's fair. All right. So we're getting a few in there, but.
Yeah, I definitely am a Toronto fan because my dad is a Toronto fan. And now where home base is Nashville, I'm also a Nashville Predators fan, but I'm only a Predators fan until the Leafs are in town. And then I'm a Toronto fan. And I proudly wear my blue jersey to the arena. And but it's always a good time. And actually, whenever I go to a game and the Leafs are playing down there, there's usually more blue in the audience than yellow because a lot of people like to, well, not now because we can't travel, but usually like people will go because the tickets are cheaper than getting them at the Air Canada Centre in Toronto. So it's always a party when the home team comes in town.
Well, it's like one of those teams is like, I feel like it's Toronto and Montreal for the most part, that it's no matter where they play, you will find fans that will support them. And it's like, you know, they could be, well, obviously Florida, because there's going to be people from Canada that travel down to Florida. But like the weirdest markets, like sometimes it'd be like an LA game or a San Jose game or like Arizona. And I'm like, you guys really go for the Leafs down here. They're like, yeah, man, we're Canadian. I'm like, okay, that's a pass. But then there are some people that are like, I guess with Arizona now, because of Matthews, you might see a few more Leafs jerseys. But at the same time, I'm like, really? Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And we have a Montreal player on the Predators team now, too. He's been with them for a few years. So you get a lot of Montreal fans as well.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about, of course, like tickets being cheaper in certain places, like I know from being a Detroit Red Wings fan originally, it's like I thought it was the best thing in the world when it was like they were in the West. Because, yes, technically, they're still an East Coast team, so I don't know really how they ended up in the Western Conference. But it was like Detroit versus Ottawa. You get people who are like, I'm not paying to see Detroit versus Ottawa. I'm like, how much are tickets? They're like, oh, $20 for like really cheap seats. I'm like, hold on, I get to see Datsuk and Zetterberg, and you're telling me I gotta pay $20. I'm like,
$20. That's the price of a drink at Mall One Stadium.
Yeah. But then ever since they moved to the East, which is fine because the games are on earlier, it's like when you want that Detroit Ottawa game, and they're in that same, I guess, Atlantic Conference or whatever. It's like, oh man, now the $20 ticket, it's like, wait, it's still the same team. It's like, yeah, but now they're rivals. I'm like, oh, so now the ticket is like $400 just to sit there. It's like, yeah, I'm like, can you go back to the West Coast?
Yeah, for sure.
But to really get off really get into it here, when you mentioned about Nashville, I'm kind of interested of how did you end up from going from Newfoundland to Nashville. Like, tell me that story, because we've interviewed plenty of acts that will tell you their story of, oh, I was really interested in country music, and of course, to be in country music, you got to go to Nashville. You got to go to these places. So I get it, but I guess in a kind of a small town or a small province kind of aspect, I'm like, Newfoundland and Nashville. How?
I will more than happily tell you that story. It's a cool little story, I think. Of course, like you said, as a country artist and a songwriter, Nashville is always the end goal. You know, you just want to experience it, whether it's to be there full time or not, or just to visit. It's a beautiful place to go and be inspired and that kind of thing. So that was always a dream of mine. I was in Toronto for a year, as I said before, but I knew that was a stepping stone to Nashville. However, my kind of door, I guess, that was opened to go there was, 2014, I think, 2014 or 2015. I did a contest in St. John's. Actually, it was province-wide, this contest, and it was Big Jib Productions' Next Country Star, Newfoundland's Next Country Star. So it was like a talent open mic kind of contest. And yeah, I was like scrolling through Facebook and saw this ad pop up that the local pub was on Torbay Road was one of the venues that was hosting this contest. And it was like looking for the next country star. And I was like, well, it's an open mic. Like, what's the worst that could happen? Like, I sing a few songs that I suck, or, you know, they don't like what I sing or whatever. What's the worst? They can say no, like whatever. So I went down to the local pub and sang like 2 originals and a cover, made it through the semifinals, and then made it through the semifinals to the finals, which was held that fall. And it was a party. I mean, Carolina East was there. Who else was there? Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain fart of all the musicians that were.
I will help you out just while you think. It's funny that you mentioned Carolina East, because she actually reached out on Instagram, I think like a day ago, and was like, hey, I would love to come on your show. And I was like, yes! I was like, great. Like, these now Newfoundland talents want to come on, which is awesome. But it's fine.
You should definitely have her. She is one of the funniest people I know, and she's such a sweetheart, and you will have the best conversation. Yeah. I promise it will be a great episode if you I
feel like I don't want to slap her in the face or anything, and I hope she takes this more as a compliment. But when I think, like, when I was looking at some of her videos, at first I'm like, is she comedy? Is she like music? Is it music? But like, she kind of reminds me of almost like an Ellie King. Like, I don't know if that's like a fair comparison, or if she's good. I'll say it to her and then she'll tell me like, what the hell?
Take that as a compliment, because Elle King is amazing. You will have the best time. She's amazing. I love her, and she's killing it right now. So she was there along with a lot of other local friends at this event, and it was just a party. We're all singing songs. The place was packed with like friends and family, and anyway, so luckily that night I was the one chosen to be the winner, and one of the judges of the contest, he had a connection with this country legend, Sammy Kershaw. Okay. And he had this connection with Sammy because this particular judge was a part of a promotions company that brought in big acts to Mile One. And Sammy Kershaw was one of the acts that they had brought in the past. And so they became Facebook buddies. And anyway, while this contest was happening, he was in conversation with Sammy, being like, we have this contest and there's interest, lots of country artists in the province. And then when I had won, they told Sammy about me, and Sammy was like, well, let me check out some of her YouTube videos. They wanted some advice from him, or like direction, or maybe he'd be interested in producing a song or something like that. Anyway, so he watched some of my videos, and he set up a conference call, him and his management team, the Holland Group, based out of Nashville, and then myself and some of the people involved in this contest. And Sammy was like, me and my team, we want to manage her, and let's bring her to Nashville and do a whole record.
Oh, wow.
So that was like, oh my gosh, pinch me moment. Like, this is Sammy Kershaw. Grew up listening to him, like Yard Sales, like this huge song, Queen of My Double Wide Trailer is another huge one. So it was crazy. And that was kind of like, I guess, a Cinderella moment. You're singing at this small local pub downtown St. John's, and then all of a sudden you get this this superstar who's like, hey, like come to Nashville. I want to do an album with you. I want to produce a record. So that's what I did. Myself and my mom came down with me, and we got into the studio. We did some of the band tracks in Nashville, and then we went to Muscle Shoals and did my vocals, and it was amazing. Got to visit the Opry while I was there and did all the tourist stuff. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up there.
Now, when you were doing this contest, how old were you at the time?
So, oh gosh, I just turned 31. So the math, if that was 2015, we're in 2021.
Yeah. Okay.
I suck at mental math.
No.
Viewers figure that out. It was 2014, 2015, and I'm 31 now.
Okay. So I know. So if you're 31 now, I know I'm turning 30 in October. So I would have been probably at this point 23 or 24. So you're probably
like 25-ish.
Yeah. So I was gonna say, like when you were mentioning earlier about like what do I got to lose? I was like, luckily she's not in, high school, because that would just be dreadful. I'm just imagining going into high school. Like, of course, yes, it's always the silver lining of if you do well, like people are gonna eat their words. But if you don't do well, it's almost like I guess the live version of a social media, where social media, when you don't do it, like when you're shit, they're like coming at you at all angles. Yeah. When you do something well, it's like crickets. But in high school, it's almost like, all right, open wound. Let's do it.
Yeah, there's high school is an adventure. Let's just keep it that way.
Yeah. So luckily you were outside that stage, because I know when we were in high school, and I feel bad because you always look back at things and you're like, all right, we grow. So it's not the worst thing in the world. But we used to have Canadian Idol. And I remember when they used to have auditions down here, and I knew no one that was involved in Canadian Idol. Like, I'm sure there were people that I probably know in passing. They just didn't tell you.
I had a terrible experience with Canadian Idol, let me tell you.
But I wouldn't explain it, but it's just like we had a guy in our class and he would audition to us, and like, this is like finals. You're in like grade 12, grade 11. You're just, and then he's like, you guys want to hear my audition for Canadian Idol? And we're like, sure. Like, we're kind of trying to do finals, but okay. So he would get up and then he would do like a Luke Bryan song. And like a part of me was like, all right, I'm kind of mad that he has the balls to get up and do this, because it's like somewhat jealousy. But at the same time, it's like other people are making fun of him because he's not that great. But I'm like, at least he's trying. At least he's getting up there and trying. So
putting himself out there. I mean, unapologetically. I think that's, standing on a stage, I'm sure with comedy and stuff too, is standing on a stage and just being vulnerable. Like that's so brave, and it's so scary. And, you're just basically, you're putting yourself out there to be judged. That's what you are doing.
Exactly what it is.
And like, I feel like comedy, especially stand-up comedy, I feel like that is the most terrifying job in the entertainment industry, because I feel like, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm a huge comedy fan. I think my perfect night out is like dinner and a comedy show. But I can't imagine being the position of a stand-up comedian and just the fear if nobody laughs, like, oh, I have anxiety just thinking about it.
It's one of those things that I think I've only done it maybe twice, because I kind of look at myself more as like around your buddies, you'll make jokes or be sarcastic. Yeah. Now it's always, they'll tell you like, oh, are you a comedian? You should do stand-up. I'm like, fair enough. But they think that that's great for their audience or their humor. But I remember going into like a pancake house, which is the worst place, because that's people just want to eat pancakes. Yeah. And I didn't know the setup. People were name dropping things of like, this guy is Bill Gates' son. And I was like, is that me? Is that like supposed to be my intro? Like, what's going on here?
I don't know.
And then when you get up and do your act, there's a few laughs, but of course they're not there for that. Like, they're there to eat pancakes. And this is a sideshow where if you go, like you said, if you're already in the mindset of a dinner and a movie, you're going to a Yuck Yucks. You're going to like an absolute comedy where it's like, I'm here to laugh. So like, make me laugh. Whereas it's not. It's like, I'm here for pancakes, and you're kind of helping, but you're kind of a sidetrack, and you're distracting me from eating my pancakes.
Yeah, I don't want to choke. Don't make me laugh too hard, though.
Yeah, exactly. They're almost like I came to get pancakes, and I didn't know there was a comedy night here, but great. Where other times you're like, because I've done it. I've gone to bars with friends, and you're like, oh, it's a Saturday night. Like, we're going to enjoy a conversation. And then there's karaoke that night and you didn't know. So then the karaoke becomes like, oh man, someone else is coming up to sing. It's like, I didn't expect this. It's like,
here's Goodbye Girl for the 5th time.
yeah, exactly. But if you knew that going in, like you knew like Saturday night's karaoke night, you're anticipating it. So
exactly.
Yeah, but tell me a little bit more about your Canadian Idol story, because I think that's interesting when you said like a not great experience.
I'm probably going to dig myself a hole. No, that was an interesting experience. So I actually think it was the same year that Justin Fancy auditioned and got like really far in the competition. Like he did really, really well. Yeah, so I showed up to my audition and I sang a Rascal Flatts song. I think it was God Bless the Broken Road.
Love that song.
Beautiful song. Love that song. So the first couple rounds, you sing it a cappella, right?
Okay.
So I show up to the first audition, sang a cappella. They pushed me on to the next round. Then I went to the next round. I sang it again. And he pushed me on to the celebrity round. So I think it was at the Sheraton Hotel, I think, is where they held it in the big convention room. And it's already nerve-wracking because when you go there, it's like, it's not like what you see on TV. Like, it's not just this little room with like one camera guy and the judges. It's like you're in the convention ballroom and it's black everywhere and you have to follow little arrows to get to the set. And then there's the judges and like 100 camera crew like around you. Like you're essentially singing for a full room of people and it's just terrifying. And I decided to learn the piano to the song the night before my audition.
Okay.
Which was my first mistake. So I was like, I could do this because you're allowed to bring instruments and they always have a piano on set during the celebrity round. So you're allowed to play an instrument for your audition. So I decided to learn the piano and I walk in super intimidated and start my song on the keyboard, mess it up. Of course I mess it up. Like nerves are going to get to me. And then so they're like, okay, like I could start again. So I did. And I don't have a super like belty voice. Like I'm a little more timid. I'm a little more like, I need a microphone to project.
It's not like it's not a Dan and Shay or
like a Whitney Houston or a Carrie Underwood, you know? So I don't have this crazy big pop belty voice. And so, one of the judges was actually like yelling at me while I was singing, like, sing louder, sing louder. And I was just like shaking at this point. Like, this is going so terribly. And then when I finished my audition, Sass Jordan was very lovely, actually. She was like, clearly you can sing. It's just like this year, like this, not what we're looking for kind of thing. And I was like, okay, like I'm fine with that. And then one of the other guys was like, you look like you're going to a funeral rather than singing a love song. Oh. And I was like, because I obviously have very dark hair. I was wearing all dark clothes. I was like in like black pants, shiny black pants, like a glittery black like top. So I was wearing all dark clothes, but still like I'm like a 15-year-old kid, and you're like, you look like you're going to a funeral instead of singing a love song on like national TV. So and obviously they're trying to get a reaction out of you for the show. Yeah. So I bit my tongue and holding back some tears. I was just like, thank you for your time. Knew the audition was bad. Left, went out the doors, and of course the camera's in your face. And I just remember crying. And I just remember looking at the camera guys and being like, just please don't show my audition on TV. Please don't show it on TV. And they didn't, thank goodness. But that moment actually made me nervous to do any auditions moving forward. I kind of had anxiety walking into any room for musical theater auditions, any kind of thing where you'd be judged in that way. But at the same time, it really motivated me to kind of prove them wrong and better myself. And just, so it was like, I think there was more pros than cons to the experience. Yeah.
Well, I don't look at it as like, in fairness, it's not like anyone's going to come after you at like Canadian Idol or anything at this point and be like, how dare you tell that story? Like, that's horrible press.
Like, I've told that story lots.
Because I was like, it's just any experience, I feel like, and it's not to diminish what you went through. It's like, I feel like anyone can relate to that in terms of, maybe they're on like a sports field, like a soccer pitch, and it's like, hey, you're 10 for 10 on penalty kicks. And then the very time that's like, you know what, I'm going to try a new penalty kick today. It's like, really? This is the time you're going to try your new penalty kick? It's like, I've been practicing for about a day. It's like, let's do this. Yeah. But I feel like it's relatable. But yeah, it's interesting that you said it's kind of, what's the best way of putting it? Like, yeah, it kind of frightens you away from auditions and stuff. Like, I get that it can play with your nerves, but what kind of got you out of that in a sense? Like, what just made you wake up one day and was like, not in Groundhog Day anymore? You're like, hey, let's do something.
Yeah, I just think, I don't know, it's all those cliche phrases where it's like you grow outside your comfort zone and the whole like the best revenge is success. So I just had kind of this fire like in me then to be like, no, like I know I can sing. I had a bad day. I had a bad audition. There's no person on this planet. You could be Beyonce. She doesn't nail every performance. I mean, I don't care who you are. You're not on 100% of the time. And
I totally am. I'm on all the time. I'm only
kidding. But yeah, no, I just, it was a lesson that I'm happy that I learned that day. And I'm happy that I learned it young. It just really I really wanted to prove those people wrong. And yeah, it scared me away from a few auditions, but I still auditioned for things anyway. I think more than anything, I just really wanted to be like, you're wrong. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this since I was a kid, like since I was like, 10, like, I knew I could sing, but it was just a bad day. And
I think it's fair because what I was actually going to mention when you mentioned bad day, it's like, that's when you, if they had to use your footage and when you were telling them, don't use my footage. And like, how they piece everything together. Cause of course they're masterminds. It's like, don't use my footage, and they freeze frame it. And it's like, so you had a bad day.
Yeah. They would
have you'd be like, oh, thanks a lot. Now I'm going to be like a meme whenever that comes trendy.
I mean, if it helps me go viral,
Well, I mean, there's good viral and there's bad. Well, I mean, in some people's aspects, they're like viral is viral, but it's okay, I guess, if you don't know the name. Like, I feel like a lot of people now, like the younger generation, and I feel like I'm going to be like Grandpa Simpson here yelling at a cloud, but it's when they go on TikTok, when they go on Instagram or YouTube, and they see like the influencers and how many followers they have. I'm like, that's great. I'm like, for the like day that's trendy, and then it comes trendy again in another month. I'm like, I can't tell you a TikToker's name. I can tell someone could tell me a name and I'd be like, never heard of them. Oh, I've seen like 5 videos. I'm like, oh, that's who that is. Doesn't matter to me, but it's kind of funny because when things start trending, like you can go back now on YouTube and be like, worst American Idol auditions, and the one that always comes to mind, don't know her name, not going to research it because I'm just not. But it's like the one where she tells Simon, I'm going to make it big one day. She like walks out, throws everything. She's like, you don't know me. But like she sang horribly. Yeah. But she's just so mad at Simon. And I'm like, a part of me wonders where she's to. And there's a part of me that's like, but do I really want to know? Do I really care enough to know? So even if they had to put it on TV of a bad audition, it's like every once in a while, maybe NTV or something loops it. Like, remember, this is where she started. And it's like, oh, some people like, ouch. It's like, this is where she's to now. It's like, well, damn. It's like, I would change my life if I didn't do well at Canadian Idol and now I'm down in Nashville producing like records and stuff. I'd be like, okay, cool. Yeah, let's do that. Let's relive all those days. But yeah, it's funny because the Canadian Idol audition, like I said, there were people that tried out that I knew in my class that just, they were like, oh yeah, I'll do it. But I've never actually heard them after the fact go like, oh yeah, it was good or it was bad. I'm like, well, I haven't seen you on TV, so I guess it didn't work out great. But, for you to say I bit my tongue when someone said, you looks like you're going to a funeral, that wouldn't be me. I'd just be like, what are you talking about? I'm 15. I'm allowed to dress in black. Because it's kind of hypocritical when you look at some acts that will do live shows and the upbeat songs and they're all dressed in black. It's like, is that same guy going to be like, yeah, song was poppy, but it looks like you're going to a funeral? It's like,
I know. Well, would you say that to Johnny Cash? He wore exactly on stage, so
yeah. I feel like he'd be the same person that would say like John Mayer. It's like, love your song, but you're boring. I'd be like, okay, but you loved his song. What difference does it make if you think he's boring? Like, it's
all opinions. It's all opinions. And actually, a friend of mine, she gave this piece of advice. She has this piece of advice that I heard her say, and she was her Tenial Arts is her name, and she's just killing it right now in the country music industry. And she has this advice that art, it's just opinions about art. So if you love what you're doing and you have people who believe in you, if you believe in yourself, then like, don't stop doing it, because you're not everyone's going to like it, but there will be people who like it. And if you love it, then keep doing it. You know, it's art. Like, I'm not going to go look at it. Like, you look at a painting in a gallery, it's like, oh my gosh, I might love that. That like would look so good in my living room, or, you know, you really appreciate like the artist maybe, or, you know, there's so many reasons why you could like a painting, but then you could get somebody else who walks in and be like, I don't get it, you know? So it's, Well,
it's funny that you say that, because it's like anything is kind of subjective to criticism and anything. Like, I look at podcasting, there are people that, when I first started doing this, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I used to follow a format of let's go through your whole career. And then people were like, oh, I like that. Like, he's actually going through like their whole career. Because that's what I grew up watching. That's what I grew up with radio and TV, where you grow up watching like biographies. They don't jump all over the place. And then there was people that are like, man, I can tell where you're going with your interview. I could tell that you're going here, here, and here. And I'm like, is that bad? And then some people are like, no. And other people are like, yeah, because it's linear. And I was like, okay. And in my mind, when I'm doing conversations with people or podcasting, like, you're right. Like, there's a part of me that grew up with the journalism background of let's do this. But there's also a part of me, it's like, man, I just wish you could just turn on a mic and just have a conversation with people. And they're like, we'll do that. And I'm like, but will people listen to that? And they're like,
I would listen to that.
Just try it and see. And I was like, and it was funny because then you like, it's like light bulb moments where you have interviews that you're like, oh, like if I had to do it in a linear way, we wouldn't have got to that topic. Or if I didn't have to bounce all over the place, this wouldn't have came up. So I get it. But there'll be other people that are like, oh, why did you switch up? Like, I liked when you were doing linear conversations. I'm like, I like both, depending on what you want. But to me, being, I guess, a Newfoundlander, as you can relate to, it's like, we don't really have, I'm not going to put it meanly, like etiquette, because we have etiquette, but it's almost like, it's a very Newfoundland etiquette where it's like, oh yeah, where are you from? Oh, that's cool. Right on. And then it's like, and then it's like, you just go all over the place. And they're like, man, I don't know if he was like being an asshole to me, or if that's just like, no, I'm not. I'm just curious, man. I'm legit curious of like things about you. It's not like I'm coming in like, all right, yeah, you know, Wayne down the street. Yeah, I got all the information on Wayne right here. If he wants to phone up the FBI, it's like, no, Wayne, relax. You just want to know where you're from and what you're doing.
Just try to be friendly.
Just try to be friendly. Have you ever found that, because again, I guess to kind of make it a little bit more random as well here, but being Newfoundland, have you ever gone to places like, of course, you said Toronto and Nashville, but you pick up on like Newfoundland tendencies that you didn't know until you went to these places? Like for me, I didn't know it was not really, and it feels weird to say this, not normal to not just like knock on someone's door and walk in. Like there would be people like, what are you doing? Like, did I invite you in? I'm like, oh, right. I'm not in Newfoundland. I just can't walk into your house and be like, hey, Dave, you got a saw? Yeah. It's like, yeah, sir, I got a saw. Hold on. Like, you go up into Ontario and it's like, did you invite him in? No, I didn't invite him in. That's weird. I'm like, sorry, hold on, I'll step out and no.
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly for me, it's my accent and my vocabulary. Even because I like a lot of Canadian friends in Nashville too, so they recognize the accent. Like certain words give me away, like the way I say car or bar, or tour, like things like that. But and like especially when I'm home for a while, like my accent becomes really thick again. So when I go back to Nashville, they're like, slow things down. And like things like simple phrases like "that's best kind" or "that's deadly." You know, things like that I say in conversation with my friends down there, and they're like, what? I don't get it. What are you saying? What does that mean? Like, I'm like, oh wait, sorry, this is what it means. Yeah. So it's mainly, and like even in songwriting too, I had a writing session with a couple Americans, and we had to rhyme with the word story.
Okay.
And I was like, I got this. Sorry. Rhymes with story. And they looked at me like I had 10 heads, and they're like, that doesn't rhyme. I'm like, what are you talking about? The word sorry rhymes with story. They're like, it's pronounced sorry.
Oh, yeah.
In America, they say sorry instead of sorry. And I was like, they're like, you just sound too Canadian. You can't say that in this country song. And I was like, oh gosh, okay. So yeah, so things like that that are just
like the what it comes to mind when you said that, because we have, like, again, other acts have mentioned similarities to that when they're, but
Yeah.
Anytime someone mentions it, I automatically think of like every How I Met Your Mother joke referencing Canada, where it was like the let's go to the mall, and it's like, I'm gonna rock your body like Canada Day, and it's the way she says it, I'm just still like, yeah, that's that's Canadian, all right. It's like Robin Sparkles on the spot. But yeah, it's funny when you mentioned that, because I've never really thought of it that way. Like I feel like, as maybe when you're listening to, say, a Keith Urban, who's an Australian, you don't notice the accent as much until like maybe there's a certain word or a certain time in a song that you're like, that's not how I would say it. But okay, totally get it. But it just kind of you don't even think about it. But yeah, I can imagine a writing session. It's like, all right, story, sorry. It's like, actually, it's sorry. It's like, no, sorry, you're wrong.
Yeah. I know. It made perfect sense to me. I was like, this is a brilliant line. I nailed it. And they both looked at me and just laughed. They're like,
That's I don't know if this is pre or post, but that's when, if it was like, say, post Justin Bieber, you'd be like, hey, Justin Bieber has a song out there called Sorry. You don't see anyone call it. You don't see people complain about that. I know. You don't see Americans being like, actually, Justin, it's sorry. It's like, doesn't flow well with the song. He says sorry. He doesn't go, is it too late now to say sorry?
That's true. That's true. But he was also the artist who was recording that song. Yeah. I guess it depends on what the song is for, whether you're pitching it to somebody else.
Yeah, true.
If he was pitching it, he might have to only be able to pitch it to another Canadian.
Yeah. I can imagine, though, like, just say in different markets, of course, it'd be fine to go in, like, say, an Australian or like a Japanese market and see how songs get like rearranged, where it's like, that's Justin Bieber's Story. It's like, actually, over here it's called Sorry. I'd be like, what's wrong with you guys? It's like, nothing. That's how we say it. I'd be like, you made Justin Bieber change his whole song. It's like, no, we didn't. We just auto-tuned the Sorry. And I'm like, that's even worse.
Yeah. Auto-tune is a beautiful thing, though. Let me tell you, it saves on time. It saves the track a million times.
It can make careers and break careers. It's funny because I think that the whole thing that a mind-blowing moment I remember when I was younger, and it's actually come up recently too, but it's like T-Pain. I listened to T-Pain when I was younger, and I was like, man, that's such auto-tune. Yeah. But then you actually see a performance that he doesn't have auto-tune. I'm like, all right, but he has pipes. Why are you auto-tuning? He's like, I just liked it, man. I just liked how it sounded. I'm like, okay, but you've been ridiculed for years about auto-tune. He's like, how much money do they have? I'm like, exactly. I'm like, fair enough. Fair enough, T-Pain.
It's true. It's true. And like, I think like Autotune is a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful technology, but you got to have the chops. You got to be able to perform live. And although unfortunately these days you can have Autotune in live performance as well. Yeah. But it's funny, like I remember watching some award shows, like award shows in general all the time, where you get like some of the legends. For example, I was watching a country music award show, whether it was the CMAs or the ACMs. I don't know which one it was.
Yeah.
But Reba came out and performed a song, and it was flawless. And it's because Reba is the kind of artist who was in the studio before Autotune was a thing.
Yeah.
He had to do takes until it was perfect, right?
Yeah.
And so she had the vocal ability to do that. And so, of course, when she is live, she's going to sound great. And then there was like some other artists, these fresh artists who very much relied on Autotune that came out and did a song, and it was like night and day.
Yeah.
Vocal ability. And yeah, it's just, Autotune is great when you don't use it as a crutch.
Yeah.
It has to be a tool that just helps elevate.
I think it's kind of interesting, and of course you would have more knowledge on it than I do, but when it comes to country music, I don't like, now it could be like old country music compared to new one, but I find like there's not a lot of, like if you had to say a Family Feud question of which genres use like the less auto-tune or whatever way you want to word it, I'd be like, country music has to be up there with number one, because it's like, I look at Garth Brooks, Tim McGraw, Reba, like Brooks and Dunn, like well before auto-tune, it's almost like you got to know the chops. Country music has its own distinct sound, but now where it's kind of the new country wave, where no offense to them because they're still great acts, like your Thomas Rhett's, your Florida Georgia Line, to an extent, like I said, like Ellie King when we were mentioning about earlier. But it's like, yeah, you can still sing, and I'm sure they have great chops, but the auto-tuned aspect is almost like, okay, how can we make this pop country? Like, right. I feel like you would never go into a Rascal Flatts studio and be like, okay, you three, love the song, but we're gonna auto-tune it. They'd look at you and be like, why touch it? Like, our vocals are fine. It's like, you're right. You're like, shame on me for even suggesting. But like, true. how do you find that? Like, because again, where you're in the actual field, do you find with people you meet that they use auto-tune a lot, or is it just more or less like, all right, we didn't get the right sound here. I know you can hit this note in a live concert, but just for this track, we're going to use it a little bit to fix it up a little bit here.
I feel like I could confidently say that everybody uses Autotune.
Okay.
Whether that's, I mean, depending on the vibe you're going for. I know that some of like Miranda Lambert's latest records, you could tell not all of it is perfectly pitched, which I love. I'm always a fan of emotion first, pitch second, because I think if you sing a song too many times or sing a phrase too many times, you lose the magic, you lose the emotion. It just becomes too repetitive. Yeah. And sometimes when you do that just to get the pitch perfect, you have to do it a bunch of times. So I think that's where Autotune is really helpful, because you can tweak the one note here or the one note there that was slightly just out, but the rest of the phrasing and the line itself was magic. So, but I think I could confidently say that most, unless you're recording live off the floor, but even then it's still a possibility, depend on the setup. But I think most, if not all, I think most, if not all, use Autotune on like a commercial record, that especially if it's like going to radio, just because it's going to be compared to what else is there. So when you hear so many songs in a row that have been Autotune, if you hear one that's not, even though it sounds really good and on pitch, you like the average ear might not hear it, but you could tell there's a difference. I would think that the majority of what's out right now, there's some kind of tuning fixes. And that's not to say it's all pitched perfectly.
No, like that's fair. Because again, I'm not coming from it from the music side, because I look at it in some relation to a podcast where you're saying like just say someone who's not into it wouldn't pick up on it right away, but someone who is. And I love your example there of like 4 or 5 songs in a row could be auto-tuned, one's not, but to an average ear, you don't hear it. Like, I listen to some of these interviews once they're done. I don't like listening to my own voice, but it's like when I listen to it after, I'm like, someone like, Brian, why are you so picky about ums and ahs and editing and like all that? I'm like, because I want to make it sound great. But then someone's like, I like the interview with ums and ahs. It makes it more realistic. I'm like, that's fine. But to me, I pick up on it coming from a whole background of listening to interviews in school where it was like, and I'm just like, I hate it. I got out of the habit, though, to be fair. When I used to do interviews, I used to have like either a pop here, like a Pineapple Crush, which Newfoundland knows what Pineapple Crush is.
Love it. Yeah.
Or like you'd have salt and vinegar chips, and of course they're like Mrs. Vicky's, but you'd eat it before the interview, and then like your mouth would be so dry, or like, and then you'd be like, and then people would be like, is he chewing? And I'm like, I hate the noise. I hate it. So I got out of the habit of it. But people would be like, who cares? Whatever. Like it's a lazy laid back interview. I'm like, well, to me, it's bothersome.
And at the end of the day, it's your podcast. So it needs to be what you want it to be and something you're proud of. So like I said, it goes back to the opinions about, all right, everyone's going to have a different opinion about what you do. So you just need to, you do you. And if you're proud of it, I mean, I promise other people are going to be proud of it too.
There will be some people that are like, I'm a little bit annoyed. But like, that's fair. Like it's some stuff in fairness that if it's things that you don't, or like that you like and they don't like, it's like, okay, I'm not changing that just because once I change it, then there's going to be other people. So you're always constantly changing. Yeah. But if there are people out there like, I wish you just wouldn't eat a bag of chips or a Pineapple Crush before an interview, I'd be like, hey, I can do that. Like, that's not a big deal. Like
I would love to eat a bag of salt and vinegar chips every time before I sing. It's a great lubricant for the vocal cords. That and like sour candy are like the best things you can have before you sing.
Have you ever had? So I know I'm probably going to date this, but I remember back at Pomeroy's here in the Ghouls. When I was in the Ghouls, they had sour keys, but you used to get the big sour keys and small little ones. And every sour key is kind of different depending on where you get it. Like there's the ones that are like not really sour keys. It's like a dollar store brand. And I'm like, you're not sour keys, man. Don't convince me you are. But when we were younger, you used to get all blue sour keys. It was like all blue, all red. And I was like, that's dope. I want more of those. But now they have, I think they're hard candy, and they're just like sour keys, but they're you can get them on Amazon, but they taste like sour keys, but they're not sour keys. So I think they're really cool. But yeah, sour stuff to me is awesome. But I as I get older, I'm kind of like, oh man, I wish I was younger when you could tolerate it. Like wartheads to me, I think it's like wartheads. And I remember a kid having 5 of them in his mouth, and I was in like grade 5, and this kid was in grade like 8. And he gave me the advice, which I think is funny because you always remember like weird advice when you're younger. And I was like looking at him like, oh man, he looks like he's choking. He was like, don't eat 10 warheads at once. And like you're 10, you're like, why would you bother? And someone was like, well, someone dared me to. I'm like, and you're stupid for doing it. And I'm like, oh no, I said that out loud. Now he's going to chase me. But wait, he has 10 warheads in his mouth. I'm okay because he's not able to breathe right now. But as I get older, when I have them, I'm like, how did I tolerate you? Especially like the purple ones. I'm like,
the purple or the black package.
Yeah.
Those are really bad. Yeah.
Yeah. But I loved them when I was younger. Like I would, it's almost like one of those things where your friends would be like, how tough are you? I'm like, how tough am I? I'm going to take this purple warhead and put it in my mouth. And they're like, it's almost like in a movie where they have the Western and the soundtrack. And it's like, he's staring you down and you don't blink. Your eyes don't water. He's like, oh my God, I'm not messing with Tobin. So you believe he just put a purple warhead in his mouth and nothing happened. And now it's like if someone gave you like lemon or like green, it's almost like, they're like, what happened to you, you big sook? I'm like, don't judge me.
The upgrade is now like tequila shots. How brave are you? Take a shot of tequila.
Yeah.
Oh, can't do so much anymore.
But yeah, see, and this is the part that I like about podcasting. You get off on a tangent. I wouldn't have guessed you for like a sour key person or a sour candy person, and I wouldn't have guessed that people would like sour stuff before singing.
Yeah, no, sour cherry blasters are my favorite. I used to go to the corner store down the road and get like the 1 cent ones. I get like a little brown paper bag with like 60 1 cent sour cherry blasters, a sour blow pop, like the lollipops that had the gum in the middle. Once you got
I have a bunch of those in the back here.
Amazing. Yeah. And then I'd like rent, my go-to movies that I'd rent with it was like The Labyrinth and what was the other one I used to always get? Like maybe The Last Unicorn.
Okay.
The Labyrinth or something like that. The Labyrinth was always like the go-to. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because when you brought up that stuff, there are people that are into podcasting that do like say 90s based, 2000s based stuff, which I'm interested to see what their content is. Mm-hmm. And there's one that always comes up on my timeline in Facebook, and it's just a guy who makes a cartoon that goes about his life when he was younger, and they talk about like Blockbuster in one episode. I'm like, I had my niece over and she's like, what's Blockbuster? And I was like, oh no. Yeah, that's how I felt, because I'm sure there's like, you feel like you're still young, but there's probably an age gap in there where you're like, okay, of course you don't know because you're like 6 or 7, but then there's like people that are 20 now or like 16 or 17, and you mentioned Blockbuster to them,
or like MySpace,
and they're just looking at you like, what are you talking about? And you're like, have I reached peak old? Like, am I just turning old? Because I think there's one that always shows up on Instagram and Facebook that it's a post where I believe it's maybe a 15 or 16-year-old, judging by how it's written, but it was like, man, I wish they would allow you on Instagram to have like on your profile music, and then someone comments under it. It's like, have we reached the age now where people don't know about MySpace because MySpace had music on it? Yeah. And I was like, it's like one of those ka-chung moments where you're like, like, okay, I think we have reached that. But yeah, to each their own. The other thing I want to really get into you a little bit about too is tell me how you got into music, because I know you mentioned, of course, the Canadian Idol experience, going to Nashville, but like what really started off? Like everyone has, I guess, something that kind of goes the light bulb in their moment of like, hey, maybe I can do this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like a lot of Newfoundlanders, I grew up in a kitchen party. My family is very, very musical, especially on my mom's side. So, most of my aunts and uncles and my grandparents even played accordions, bagpipes, guitars, mandolins, sang, danced. So I was definitely surrounded by music. And my mom is actually a country artist as well. So she recorded in Nashville. She toured across the country. She recorded many albums. And so I grew up listening to her sing country music. I was probably 3 or 4 when I would just listen to her sing Coat of Many Colors and Coal Miner's Daughter and, all these Patsy Cline, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn. And my dad's a big country music fan, so he loves Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson. So I grew up around that kind of music. And of course, with Newfoundland, you grow up around the Irish Celtic traditional music. So I kind of was getting it from all sides. And I just could never imagine doing anything else besides music. That's always what I've done. When I was 11, myself and my mom and my uncle and my cousin, we had a family band called the Cormiers. And so we toured and performed and recorded Celtic traditional music. So that was the first time a song that I took part in writing. I was 11 in the recording studio, recording a song I wrote. So that, I think, was the moment I knew I wanted to write music as well. But yeah, so music has kind of always been my thing. I don't remember a time when it wasn't.
That's fair. It's interesting to me because when you ask people that question and like they give you an example of, either they grew up around it or they got into a program that had it. Because to me, when I think of, say, podcasting or broadcast, it's almost like you have to have an interest in what you do. That's it. Like it's your end goal, or you have, basically that is what you're on the surface of the earth for. But yeah, because when I think about asking that question to people, I'm like, well, imagine if someone turned it around on me. It's like, well, how'd you get into broadcasting? There's a whole side step of it, but I'm like, man, I don't really think I got into broadcasting as much until maybe like Conan O'Brien's The Tonight Show, because I knew I liked comedy, but it was like I was either like on this fence of like, okay, I either have to go to SNL to be a comedian, or I have to go to CBC and be super serious about news. And I'm like, man, there's no middle ground. And then when I looked at like Conan on The Tonight Show, which isn't the best Conan, obviously, but I looked at him like, hold on, this guy's funny. He gets to do interviews and people watch him. I'm like, is this allowed? It's like, how come no one told me this? It's like, because you were too young and he's on at like 12:30 at night. We're not going to keep up a 10-year-old at 12:30 to be like, hey, you might like this someday. It's like, or I could regret being up at 12:30 to watch Conan. But no, especially in Newfoundland, I should be honest with Newfoundland, even when they call it The Tonight Show, it's on at what, like 1:30 our time?
Way past our bedtime.
It's so funny because when people bring it up of like years ago, so when we had the 2010 Olympics and all this Conan Leno feud was on the go, when they're like, he's actually thinking about changing the Tonight Show to the Tomorrow Show because it comes on 12:05. I'm like, listen, guys, if you're in Newfoundland, no wonder it's not a big deal here because it's always been the Tomorrow Show. Even when Johnny Carson hosted it was the Tomorrow Show. So I get it. It's the American audience, but there's a part of me that's like, hey, what are you going to do? Just move it back from 1:30 to 2 o'clock in the morning? Okay. It's now the Tomorrow Show. Yeah. But yeah, I liked your answer because, of course, growing up in Newfoundland, if you're not surrounded by music or somehow entrenched in it, it's almost like you live under a rock. It's like you might live on the rock, but you're living under a rock.
That's good. That's a good phrase.
But tell me, like, who are some people that you kind of idolized or looked up to? Because, of course, growing up around music, I know you said the musical influence, your mom was playing music as well, but there has to be people, I guess, on the radio that you were like, oh, like, I really like how she sounds, or, geez, I wish I could do what they were doing. Like, tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so many. I mean, Dolly Parton is always a big one, even though it wasn't really radio. It was just hearing my mom sing Dolly's songs and growing up around that. So a lot of the legends of country music. But I mean, Shania Twain was a big one for me. The Dixie Chicks were big for me. Actually, Kim Stockwood and Dabnett Doyle locally. Kim Stockwood was my very first time buying a CD. I think I was in grade 5 when I bought it with my own money. I got Britney Spears, Baby One More Time, and I got Kim Stockwood's. I can't remember the name of the record.
I'm sure that's like a big, what do you call it? Like a big feather in her hat or something. It's like, hey, it's like you're comparing me with Britney Spears. These are your first CDs that you ever bought.
Yeah, it's true. I'll never forget it. Those are the two. And I loved pop music too when I was a kid. I loved Christina Aguilera. I loved the Backstreet Boys. Loved like all that stuff. I totally loved so many genres of music. I loved Eminem. My older sister was a big fan of like rock and rap, and she had much music playing all the time. So I grew up around a lot of different influences. So yeah, it's hard to kind of pinpoint one.
No, I mean that's fair. Like you gave me the one that you gave me for the list. It's kind of like similar to what I grew up with and liked. But when you were talking about like your first CDs, like I think my first CD I ever got was, of course, like I think it was a Backstreet Boys one. It was like I think it's like Black and Blue.
Yeah.
And then of course, as parents do, and you know, I fall into the trap being an uncle now, but it's like you kind of pick up on someone that they like or they hear, and they might just off-puttingly, not knowing that they're really trusting you the whole time of like, don't tell anyone else I said this, but this artist I really like. And you're like, oh, this is like a moment that they're trusting me, but you don't know it at the time. Because I remember telling my mom, I was like, I don't even know if it was my mom or just as much as she's probably seen the CD and thought it was like $10, but it was like Ashley Simpson. And she had like Pieces of Me and I was like,
I had that CD too.
Yeah. And like, I remember going to bowling. So they used to play it all the time on 99.1. And it was like coming back from bowling. And I think she must have just or got the idea of like, well, Brian actually isn't complaining about this song in the car. And I got that CD and I was like, Mom, what are you doing? Like, people are going to come over and they're going to see this CD. And like, now I'm kind of like, well, I still have it. And it's great because of like where she's 2, where, you know, the fact that she didn't stick around as much, but I look at it and I'm like, okay, that's good. But there are definitely artists out there. Like I have Celtic Connection CDs, but when you're smaller, it's just music. You don't really look at it as like local compared to global. Like I was actually going to bring this up to you when you mentioned all this and before I went off on the tangent there, but like Much Music, that's where you see a lot of acts, and you don't even know if they're Canadian. Like Avril Lavigne to me could have been from like Switzerland, and Backstreet Boys could have been like three doors down the street. And I'm like,
and like the big shiny tunes.
Yeah,
my sister had all those CDs, so I was listening to them all the time, and then burning off my own CDs, like downloading stream through
People
Limewire.
Now, if you say burning off your own CDs or Limewire, they're like, what is that? Is that some kind of app for like dating? It's like Limewire.
Tape. Yeah.
But yeah, like I was going to mention, because when you see these acts, you don't care where they're from. You don't care. Like I'm almost ripping out Backstreet Boys, where it's like you don't care where they're from. But I remember watching CMT, and you would see like the Chevy Top 20, and it was just mind blowing to me on like a Saturday night that you'd see like the Ennis Sisters. I'm trying to remember the song now. It was more poppy than just your basic one, where It's Not About You. There you go. And that was on a Chevy Top 20. And I was like, holy shit, an act from Newfoundland is in between Garth Brooks and Shania Twain at number 8. And you're telling me that they can rise to like number 2 or number 1 across like all of Canada? That's crazy. We don't really have that as much anymore, where you can turn on a TV channel and see the countdowns. But when that actually sank into me, I was like, holy fuck. Like, are you kidding me? Like, we're Newfoundlanders and we're actually on CMT. So have you ever had like any of those moments? Like, of course, you said buying the CD. And I guess when you were younger, you're like, I like both music. But when you get older, did you ever look and be like, oh my God, that person's a Newfoundlander and they're actually charting?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of a lot of local artists. I think we have the most ridiculous talent from this province. I still fangirl over a lot of them, even though I've played music with a lot of them. I've hung out with a lot of them. Like Alan Doyle is one. Like there's been times like Alan has like texted me, and I just like, I'm like, okay, Mallory, keep her cool. Before you text him back. But he's the best person. I just adore Alan. He's such a supporter of emerging artists. And I remember like I didn't even like know him, and I sent him an email one time. I got his email off a friend of mine, just asking for his advice for like a new artist in the industry. Like what should I do to get myself out there? And he sent me back an email that was like so long. And it was the sweet, like right away too. He was so sweet. Like he didn't have to do that. Like he's a busy guy. And ever since then, I will gush and gush about how amazing he is. He's so great. And yeah, so Alan is one of them. I mentioned Carolina East. Love her. She's super talented. Fairgale. I mean, come on. How are they not like getting #1 songs on national scales right now? Like they're just absolutely ridiculously talented. Nick Earl, Rachel Cousins. Like I'm a huge fan of my friends here, and it's one of the reasons I love coming home, because I just love to go out and see them play. I love to collaborate. Yeah, those are kind of moments where like you said, I'm just constantly amazed and inspired by the people here in this province. And yeah, I'll be their #1 fan forever. It's great.
Well, it's funny because you said that, and because we had Damien Fowler on when we were first starting this podcast, and I grew up, and I felt like kind of bad at the point because I was like, geez, like I remember Damien when I was younger watching NTV, and right before, just say, when NTV would plug like 6 o'clock in the morning, be like Celtic Connection, and you'd see music videos on there, and I'm like, all right, you're a music video. Like, just turn back on Sharon Lois and Brian, please. Or like, can you just turn on Inspector Gadget? I don't want to watch this. But the one that stuck in my mind was Damien Fowler. It's like, No Second Chances.
Yeah.
And I was like, when I sent him the invite, I was like, he's not going to come on and talk about a song that's like 20 years old. And he was like, sure, I'd love to. I was like, okay.
He's a great guy.
And it's weird because in my mind as Newfoundlanders, because we've talked about this with Tom Power as well, it's like we have this kind of energy where it's like we just treat you like a normal person. We don't care if you're Britney Spears or the guy selling like groceries down the street. It's like, you're a person, you're successful, okay. But I think that was the moment where it's like, oh my God, I've got Damien Fowler. And like I haven't kept up with him, to be fair, but it's almost like I have a guy that I was watching on TV do a music video, and he's going to be on my podcast. Okay, cool. And when I talked to him, that was like one of the very things he mentioned. He's like, if we had the resources of a Nashville, of like a Toronto or a Vancouver, he's like, you would not see our Newfoundland talent go to Nashville to get known. People would come here and be like, we're setting up shop here. We're going to put a record company here because look at all the talent that's surrounded here. And I'm like, that's fair. Like there is a lot of talent out there that even in the last year that I've come across, I'm like, okay, I didn't know you guys existed, but okay, that's cool that you somehow popped up on the timeline. I'm like, yeah, I've mentioned it to plenty of acts across Canada where if you don't, it's almost like a trigger where if I don't know you're Canadian, and it's not like it's supposed to be a big deal, but if it doesn't say indie band or if it doesn't say local, I'm like, all right, you'll listen to a song, because sometimes it'll come up on an Instagram post. I'm like, that's really good. Okay, where are they from? Like, they have to be from like New York, LA. It's like, Manitoba. I'm like, really? Manitoba? Okay. All right, put them on, like, let's get them on this episode and let's promote them. And they're like, thank you so much. I'm like, no, thank you. Like, you guys sound great. What's happening? Why aren't you guys like world famous? They're like, we don't know. It's like, okay.
There's something so satisfying, I find, when you stumble across an artist or a band or a song that is just absolutely amazing. Yeah. And like none of your friend groups know who they are. So you get to like introduce the music to these people and just be like, oh my gosh, I need to check this out. They're so cool. I just find that so satisfying. Like I remember when Chris Stapleton kind of, he dropped like his first album or his first song, and the buzz was happening in Nashville, I think, before the buzz was happening in Newfoundland. Yeah. And I remember coming home and being like to my brother, Cecil, I was like, Cecil, you need to check out Chris Stapleton. And he was like, okay, cool. And then he like got onto Chris Stapleton and like loved it. And I was like so excited that I introduced my brother to this artist that he didn't know before and loved it. And same thing with Dawes. I'm a really big fan of Dawes. And when I was living in Toronto, Dawes was doing a concert. Was it the Music Hall? I can't remember where it was. Anyway, my brother and my sister-in-law were coming up to visit. And I was like, okay, you're coming up while this concert's happening. I'm getting you tickets. You need to go listen to all their albums before you come. And so they did. They were obsessed with Dawes. They knew more songs than I did by the time they showed up, and knew like every word to every song. And it was just such a special experience to share with them. And yeah, I'm such a fan of music.
I like those answers because I remember when I was at Carleton, there was a few people in your class. And of course sometimes you just randomly come across one song or one artist because you hear them on the radio. And then now I feel like I don't want to butcher radio because I'm sure there's people that still listen to it. I know, like, if Cabin Party, you'll listen to that if you're up at the cabin, of course, but I feel like it's less and less. And I think Axe will probably agree that people don't really buy full albums anymore as much as they buy singular songs, right? So I remember at Carleton, one of my friends was like, you have to hear the 1975. And to me, I'm really old school where it's almost like, all right, fuck off, like go away. And then like after like the 10th time, you're like, all right, but it's still like forceful. It's like, I'm not typing in YouTube 1975. I have to stumble across it naturally. Mm-hmm. So I did, and I love the 1975. But when you're talking about like certain acts that you get to kind of experience first before anyone else, I never had one of those moments until maybe my last year in university. And it just showed up on a timeline of a YouTube video where sometimes YouTube videos are like 15-second clips. Sometimes they're like a whole goddamn song. And that's what happened. I left the room. I was like, all right, like an ad started to play. And the song was, I think, Take My Hand by Picture This. They're like an Irish band. And I was like, man, this song is really good. I was like, all right, I'm going to download some more songs. And now I think I think they're still on the rise. But of course, now they've gone from Ireland over to the States, made a little bit more poppy songs, but they're still Irish. You still get that Irish accent. Yeah. And I was like, I remember telling people about this band, and now they're like, oh, I love Picture This. And then there are people like, what's Picture This? And then they introduce it. They don't give me credit. Then they're like, oh, I found it. I'm like, whatever. If you want to claim that you found it, cool. But I love, like what you said, when you get to introduce people to music, and it's like, I was there before they had 1,000K or 1,000 listeners.
Exactly. It's so cool because it makes you feel... I feel like it makes you feel more connected to the band or the artist. It makes you feel like you're a part of their story. And it's more exciting to celebrate their victories and their wins when you see them go from like this indie band or this indie artist, and then all of a sudden they sign a major record deal, or they're getting, millions of streams, or like it seems like they have risen to this, stardom.
Yeah.
It's really cool to kind of see that happen.
It's weird too, in a sense that sometimes you forget, because everyone's caught up in their own stuff, that sometimes you forget where artists come from. Like I remember telling my friends, I guess in a way, like, so I like rap music a little bit too, but sometimes these acts come out of nowhere, and that's where you're like, oh my God, their success happened overnight. And someone's like, you realize that that's not true at all. Like to me, Bruno Mars just came out of nowhere. And then like people are like, no, you remember that he was featured on a whole bunch of songs. I'm like, oh, I never heard them. Like, of course, nobody heard them. Everyone remembers The Way You Are or whatever that one is, because that was a feature, and then he blew up from there. And the same with like The Weeknd. We've had an act on that said they seen The Weeknd when he was just opening shows for people. I'm like, that has to be crazy to you now to think that the person that you saw opening shows is now on a Super Bowl. So it's like, I can just imagine like in years, just say years from now, it's like you see a Rachel Cousins at an ECMA like actually winning an award, or a Mallory Johnson winning an award. And I'm like, it's all sort of relative, because it's like you all start somewhere. But I like when to you guys, of course, you're going to work your asses off regardless. But there are going to be, of course, people that jump aboard when they know, like, oh my God, like there's probably people out there that knew Taylor Swift before she was Taylor Swift. And then there's people that now just listen to Taylor Swift and be like, I really like Taylor Swift stuff now. And it's like, okay, have you heard of Bad Blood or 22? They're like, no, now. I'm like, all right, like relax. Like I wasn't going after you.
Like, you're not a real fan because you have Fearless and Red. And like, do you know this bonus track on our deluxe album in 2002? Yeah.
Well, it's like to me, it's amazing to me, because we'll go back for our age group, and there are a crowd that will say, I love Beyonce. Yeah. It's like, I like Destiny's Child. And they're like, what's a Destiny's Child? I'm like,
you've been living under a rock.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I know you're living on a rock, but are you under the rock? It's like, but even that, like, I like Justin Timberlake. It's like, oh, you mean NSYNC? They're like, what's an NSYNC? And you're like, do you mean lip sync? And I'm like,
10 years from now, they'll be doing that with Harry Styles. It'd be like,
that's where I was going to go. Cause I mean, we grew up with, like, I know we're old sort of, but it's like, we grew up watching One Direction form to now watching them all branch off. And it's just amazing to me, because I guess we kind of grew up with Backstreet Boys, but we're still young, where it's like, we didn't get their whole story. We got their peak, but to watch One Direction's whole story. And it's like, I look back, and when people used to tell you when you were younger, like, man, time flies. Like, you don't take that for granted. I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, screw you. And now I look at it like, man, that band was only together for like 4 or 5 years. And there's a point where you're like, I hate you because all the girls like you. And why don't they like me? And now you're like, no, but man, they had so many good songs. And then you're like, I feel like they'll do a reunion tour, a reunion album. And you're like, you'll have to go back to like your 16-year-old self, like, oh, great. And then you're like,
yeah. Yeah.
All the girls will be like, I love One Direction. You're like, I fucking hate these guys. But in secret, you're like they're coming back to do an album. Oh my God, I'm so happy. I guess like to kind of clue up the interview, because I like we went all over the place. I hope you enjoyed it too.
I loved it. It's been super fun. I can't believe we've been an hour already. That's great.
Yeah, I was looking at the clock. I'm like, I hope she doesn't mind that's been an hour, but I guess a lot of them have been. Let's talk a little bit about, because I feel like it'd be so dismissive if we don't, but the East Coast Music Awards.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, because of course we've had all the other acts on there were like in the rising star category or doing their own show, but with COVID, it's always been a mess, and we're not blaming anyone for that. I've always said that to everyone. I'm like, listen, we're not blaming Music Newfoundland. We're not going after ECMAs, but tell me a little bit about like how it all essentially came together for you. Like, when did they decide to tell you you're doing it virtually, and like what were your, I guess, plans, and was this your first time going or supposed to be going to an ECMAs?
So I've been going to the ECMAs for years. First time I went to the ECMAs, I was nominated with my family band in the, I think the Celtic category.
Celtic folk.
Celtic folk. And we were up against the Rankin family. So we obviously weren't going to win that one. But no, I've been going to the ECMAs for years, and gosh, I was so excited. I was nominated in 2019 for the Country Recording of the Year, and I took it home, which was, I think, probably one of my biggest accomplishments to date, was getting that award. And so I've done the showcases and stuff too, and it's always one of my favorite events of the year. You get to see all your friends, you get to party, have kitchen parties with musicians from all over the East Coast, and your nights kind of run into your mornings very easily. But it's always a really wonderful, wonderful time. And this year, sadly, I mean, I know everyone was really excited to potentially do it in person.
Yeah.
But I'm really impressed with the ECMAs being able to switch gears so quickly and still have this go ahead. But this year, when I was told I was getting offered a showcase, they asked if I was able to go in person. And at the time, I didn't think I was going to be able to. I was either still going to be in Nashville or I was going to be en route to Newfoundland, but my quarantine would have conflicted with the dates anyway. So I said, oh my gosh, like obviously I would love to do this showcase. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be there. Is there any virtual option? Like if there is a virtual option, let me know. If not, thank you so much. I can't wait to see you guys next year, kind of thing. And they got back to me and said, no, like we are going to offer a virtual option for the artists who aren't comfortable yet to be there in person or who can't make it, which was amazing of them to be able to do that. And so the whole time I knew mine was going to be virtual. And then it just came down to it that everybody's ended up having to be virtual. So,
because I kind of look at it from the standpoint of like, there's a double-edged sword, and everyone has, it's kind of when you get older and you try to look at things from both perspectives, it's like, you know, the ECMAs are trying to put on the best performance or the best show they can. There's obviously going to be like certain acts that are like, hey, you're not there yet, but you know, we're still going to welcome you back. But it's just like this year, it's not like if we did it live, sure, you'd have a spot. But this year, where we're not doing it live, it's kind of hard. Like I looked at some of the people that were nominated for certain awards, like your Neon Dreams, your Classified, and like I was kind of surprised in a way where I'm like, Neon Dreams is from Nova Scotia, but yet now they're over in like I think South America when we're recording this anyway, and like they're doing their first tour over there during certain dates. I'm like, okay, so how would they be able to be at the ECMAs? They would have to do it virtually, and maybe Classified's like, listen, with everything on the go with COVID, I don't want anywhere to touch it. Can we do that virtually? And I'm like, so how are you going to let the bigger acts be virtual, but then tell the smaller acts, no, you have to come? So I'm like, you got to make it kind of even. But in their defense, they'll probably be like, hey, these people are made. Like, you're going to watch them if they're here or not. These ones that are rising stars, we kind of want them here so that people can come see them. And it's like, fair enough. But I do like how they gave everyone that opportunity afterwards of like, hey, like do it from the comfort of your own home. If that works for you, I'd be like, yeah, that does work for me.
Exactly. And I'm sure that if anyone questioned the same way I did, like it was just me asking them, like, I know this is an in-person offer, but like, is there anything we can do to make this virtually? I mean, I'm sure if any act had asked that same question, they would have been given the same option. So it's really wonderful to see them still be able to adapt so quickly and still want to be able to celebrate the East Coast music, because it's such a special time of the year. And to think of like some friends of mine from here too, like their first nominations or their first time getting a showcase, like it's really heartbreaking that they won't get to have that experience in person. But at the same time, it's really awesome that ECMA is still pulling everybody together and still being able to somehow celebrate in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, because it's, to me, when I look at it from kind of, I guess, an Ontario perspective, essentially, I am born and raised in Newfoundland, but when I'm in Ontario, the big thing that they used to have is kind of the Boots and Hearts festivals. And, you know, it's funny to me now, again, 2020 hindsight, but they have almost similar, like a rising star stage themselves, like an opening act. And you're thinking like anyone else would, unless you're like family members or their friends, you're like, all right, who are the big names to see Boots and Hearts this year? You're like, oh, like John Party. Oh, Garth Brooks is going to be, well, maybe not Garth, but like Tim McGraw. You're like, oh, I'm here to see. And then you see like lower down, right on the bottom of the card, it's like Robert Adelini. It's like Jess and Tay. And you're like, okay.
And they're so excited. They're the ones who they're most excited to be.
Yeah. And then like years later, like it could be 4 or 5 years later, they're like middle of the pack on the card. And then depending on how they go. Yeah. And then like like when they get a little bit up there with like, say, charting hits, now they're like, maybe they're still not going to be maybe down the road, but they're maybe like, they're still on the main card or the main headline, but it's like maybe 5th or 6th.
Yeah.
Where you're like, oh, okay. Like, obviously I'm here to see these headlines, but oh yeah, I've heard a couple of her songs. And then it's like, geez, is this her first year? It's like, no, she's been here for like 4 or 5 years. Just, you didn't recognize her. And it's like, not to feel bad about it. Of course, it happens to everyone. Yeah. But I do like those stories because it's the same with an ECMA. It's like yourself, say, Quote the Ravens, like ones that we've had on. At the time, you could be thinking, okay, like, yeah, my family knows about me. A few people I've obviously performed with know about me. And then like 4 or 5 years down the road, it's almost like, hey, have you heard of Mallory Johnson? It's like, oh yeah, she was on like The Rising Star. That's a diehard. And there's other people like, oh yeah, she has a song on the radio. I really like that. It's like, is she nominated this year? It's like, yeah. Is that her first one? It's like, no, this is probably the first one she's going to win, but she's been nominated like twice in the past. And it's like, oh, cool. So that's how generally I find it goes. But it's interesting because when people were comparing it, I compare Boots and Hearts to an ECMAs in that sense where you have to have your main headlines to kind of draw people in. But then those same people that really just are there for music will be like, oh, like, I really hope that person goes somewhere someday. And then it's like, they come back in like 5 years, like, I told you they go somewhere someday. You're like, I'm just here because I heard one of her songs and I liked it and now I'm a fan. Like your whole Taylor Swift thing that you mentioned earlier, where it's like,
exactly.
I know it's the next album.
It's true. Like it's really cool to see that growth. And like what we were talking about earlier is, you know, when people think that they're become famous overnight, it's like, no, like they've been working hard at this for so long. And with those kinds of situations, like your name, like if someone is really going to like, if you make an impression or someone's going to get to know you, it's like your name kind of needs to cross their awareness like 5 or 6 times before they retain it. You know, that's like when you're sending an email to like pitch something, it's like, hi, I'm so-and-so. Like, don't be afraid to follow up because they probably get hundreds of emails a day. And like your name needs to cross their screen a couple times for them to even care, you know? So
I feel too with, of course, when you were mentioning about following up, obviously, yes, that's key because it's funny that a lot of acts, now I don't know if you can kind of, I guess you can kind of go off on your own story about this as well, but some acts that we've had on is like, we don't know if we should follow up with some because we're just kind of just trying to get into the business. Like I believe Quote the Raven had a similar approach to what I said is it's like a catch-22. Some people were like, tell me your whole life story. Some people like, don't tell me your whole life story. It's like, why did you follow up with me? It's like, I have your email. It's like, I have your email. I'm just busy. And then there's other ones like, I'm so glad you followed up. I lost your email. And you're like, okay, like it's weird. It's a weird dynamic. Like, I guess when you send out stuff like for promotion for yourself, or if you want to follow up with people, what do you take as it is? Do you do it like short and simple, or do you be like, hey, Mallory Johnson, I was born on October, blah, 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 and go like right into detail?
I feel like it's so case specific. Yeah. I don't know. But then like, just going cold turkey. I don't like if it's a venue, I usually like, say if I want to pitch myself to a venue in Nashville, I'll be like, here's the places I played. Okay. Here's like my management, here's my website, here's my music. Here's some live performance videos. So like it's like you said, it's really hard to know where the line is.
There's no like, you know, publicity 101 or like how to contact a rep, because it's in fairness when some people are telling you, and I get it when you're first starting off, you're taking advice from everyone. You're just trying to make it per se. And I'm not saying at any point that this podcast is like made. It's not like it's number one in Canada. And I'm fair with that. Like I'm not going to come out here, even if it was number one in Canada, and be like, we're number one in Canada, blah, blah. Like it's Newfoundland again, where it's a laid back approach of like, I'm doing okay. You're doing okay. Great. But I thought it was funny because there's some acts that you will email and they're like, they're just busy. Like, why did you email us? I'm like, all I did was send you an email. And then there's parts where it's almost like you are getting mad at me for sending you an email and
to want to promote you.
Yeah. Like, and there's a part of you that's kind of like, oh man, I just pissed off. Like just say, a top name in the industry's PR and they're never going to come on my show. So therefore I'm going to cancel my show. But then there's another part of you that's like, no, stick to your guns. What the fuck did you even do wrong? So yeah. And then I always have people that will tell you, well, you know, 4 or 5 years down the road, if you're the top ranked podcast or if people like you, then watch their PR person come back to you and be like, act like nothing's happened. They'll just be like, hey, do you want to have this person on? Then that's up to you then to be like, yeah, sure. I'd love to have them on, but you stay the fuck away from me. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with you.
The ball is in your court then.
Yeah. But yeah, it's funny how that kind of comes about, because I guess when you watch, say, music documentaries or documentaries in itself, and sometimes you might see it on Instagram or Twitter, depending on the beef, but it's like, oh yeah, it's like that person was so nice to me even when I was an asshole to them when I was younger, or like that person snubbed me when I was a nobody. But when I became a somebody, I could have done the same thing. And then there's other stories that are like vice versa, where it's like when I became someone, I remembered that and like fuck them, we're not having them on. I'm like, well, and then there are people who be like, how dare you? Like, why don't you grow up? I'm like, well, geez, like, are you really going to oust them? That could be something really personal that they didn't like, or they thought it wasn't a big deal. Like when you said reaching out to Alan Doyle and him sending a message, that's great. Alan Doyle could do that for everybody. And there's a mindset like myself of like, yeah, how hard is that to do? But then there are other people that are famous that could be just be like, oh my God, this random person send me tips about how to become like, and you're like, okay, I'll remember that. Like,
yeah. And then they could just be having a bad day. You know? It's just, you don't know what's going on in somebody else's life. So it's hard to not take things personally sometimes. Believe me, I get it. For a long time, like my Canadian Idol story, I was like, F this guy, I'm going to prove him wrong. Can't wait for the full circle moment, you know? But then at the same time, it's like, no, like that, again, the cliche.
Sometimes it works in your favor. I mean, listen, if it took you basically to say, fuck this guy, I'm going back out on stage again. It's like, imagine if you're just like, no, he's right. It's like every time someone's right, you're like, okay, well, Jesus, you're going nowhere. But
yeah, you need a strong backbone in the entertainment industry. That's for sure.
It's like my favorite story to tell people is more or less when we were doing like shout outs or stuff for episodes. And I really wanted Rick Mercer on before you called the kind of quits for it. And I remember sending his PR email and they were like, all right, like not really, no. And I was like, oh, okay, not really, no. Okay, let's see if Rick Mercer has Facebook. So then I kept on contact. And of course, if you're not on the friends list, it could go somewhere else. So I was sending like 5 or 6 messages in the span of months. And then finally, I think he replied, he's like, I see them. It's like, okay. And he's like, I will come on. He's like, I was like, okay. And I was like, oh, he's really pissed. But I'm like, if it's only one time you're ever going to get him on. And he was fine. It was just like one of those things where it's like, hey, I'll come on, but just, whoa, like relax. But sometimes you have to like really push people to be like, hey, do you see me? Like I'm trying to get you on for a reason, blah, blah, blah. And
just acknowledge that you saw it.
Yeah, exactly. But he was fine. But it was like one of my favorite stories because when he came on, then I think he's done a few more shout outs for like Christmas episodes for us. But some people would come to you and be like, okay, you sent him one message. He either seen it or didn't. That's it. Let it be. And I'm like, no. I want a friggin' answer. Like, either he's going to come back and be like, I am never doing your show. You're crazy. Or he'll come on and be like, yeah, man, I just didn't see it. I'm like, there you go. At least you get something. So,
yeah. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah. The worst that could happen is like, you contacted Rick Mercer. You're a Newfoundlander, right? Give me back your Newfoundland card. I'm like,
you were the worst podcast in Canada.
yeah. What Newfoundland card? I don't. It's like you were born in Newfoundland. I'm like, yeah. No one ever told me about Newfoundland card. Well, we got it now. So you're revoked from being a Newfoundlander. All because I contacted Rick Mercer. It's like, yeah, you don't mess with Newfoundland's greats. I'm like, oh, okay. And like 5 years down the road, it's like, Brian, can you do this thing for me? I'm like, oh, I'm a Newfoundland great now. Don't mess with Newfoundland great. But yeah, full circle. The last thing I want to talk about before we wrap it up, Mallory, is what have you been doing, I guess, to keep yourself busy during COVID? Now, some people have, it's funny when you look at social media and people are like, if you didn't accomplish something during COVID, it was wasted time. I'm like, no, it's not. No, it's not. But it's funny because when people come on and then they'll tell me what they've done during COVID, I'm like, okay, I feel like I've done nothing, because people are like, oh, well, I learned how to produce an album. It's like, I actually wrote more songs and now I'm actually producing my first album. And it's like, well, I learned how to edit. I'm like, I just kept my podcast going. And at the beginning, I didn't think I was going to keep it going. So I guess that's an accomplishment.
That's a huge accomplishment. I mean, having a podcast in general is tough. I mean, like, the fact that you're coming on and having these conversations with people all the time, like that's huge. I think it's something to be celebrated. And clearly we've been having a great time, because we're over an hour and this is great. So, but yeah, no, I recorded an album.
There you go.
Yeah.
I feel like there should be a chalkboard behind me where it's like, Dwayne, put another one on the chalkboard.
Yeah. Keep that tally. Yeah. No, I recorded a record. I'm just waiting for my mixes now. We're doing the overdubbing and stuff. So my producer, I'm so excited to hear the mixes. So hopefully that'll be out in the fall. That's my plan. The fall coming. So, but timelines change all the time, as we know, with COVID.
Yeah.
Very easy things to change. So that's the plan.
Yeah. And what kind of things have you been doing? Of course, obviously the musical side, great. That's an accomplishment in itself. Hopefully when it comes out, we'll have a follow-up.
Yeah, I love that.
And you'll be like telling your friends, like, listen, I've got an hour and a half interview to do with Brian, so just like.
Well, I'm going to wait till you email me 5 times, and then I'm
exactly. Yeah, I'll go on Instagram and be like, who does this Mallory Johnson think she is? And then you'll be like, easy. But what other things have you been doing, I guess, kind of in an interesting aspect? Not that wasn't, but to keep you busy in COVID, like, have you been watching certain things on Netflix? Have you been going back and like digging up old episodes of things? Because to me, I've never had the time, even though I'm one of those kids that I'm not a big moviegoer. And I felt like during COVID, when it really got into deep, I'm like, man, I'm going to go back and watch all these different movies that like people would reference and I had no clue. I say that, still haven't, but I did catch up on Saved by the Bell college years. And I feel like that's a little bit of an accomplishment in itself, to be like, hey, I caught up on old TV shows that I used to watch that I forgot kind of existed until now.
Yeah, I mean, what did I not watch? Better question. That's probably a smaller list. Yeah, I definitely did a lot of Netflix, a lot of Hulu, a lot of Disney Plus. I ended up watching all of like the Marvel and the DC.
Oh, really?
Okay. Stuff, like in chronological order. I think I messed up the order of a couple of them, because all of a sudden one character was dead and then they were alive. It was really, it was hard going from like, okay, here's like, and then the DC, like watching all the Superman, Batman, and then you go like, it was just all over the place, but fun. I love those movies. I did a lot of puzzles. Okay. I hiked a lot last summer when I was here. I did a lot of like exploring Newfoundland that I wouldn't have time to otherwise when I was here. So spent a lot of time with family. Yeah, it was those were definitely the good things I think that came out of it. I got a lot of quality time with my family that I wouldn't have normally. I spent a lot more time in Newfoundland than I was supposed to originally. So I'm really thankful for that. So
yeah, that's fair. I mean, when you, I guess to kind of clue it up here in the whole aspect of it, because I came actually from Ottawa to Newfoundland when COVID happened, and a lot of my friends that were in Ottawa went back to their hometowns, and I was like, oh, it's like, it almost feels like it's a ghost town where it's like I don't know, I guess it could be just me that feels this way, but it's almost like when I went from university, and when you graduate university, like I don't think it really entrenches in your mind, because if you go to Mon or Kona down here, it's like, oh yeah, I've seen you in high school. I get to see you again at Mon. Fuck. It's like, or great. It's just a bigger high. Yeah, exactly. Where up away, it doesn't really entrench in your mind. Now, of course, it does to them. But to me, it's like you went from BC to Ottawa. Oh, now school's over. Okay, so you're going back to BC, but it doesn't really sink in. And I'm like, oh my God, like I'm not going to see you for a while, if ever. So when this COVID happened, I'm like, wow, I wonder how many friendships and stuff just got like not destroyed, but more or less a little bit like, I guess kind of torn, but not whole torn, because it's like you don't like, that's because some people like myself take these kind of signs from the universe of like, okay, it's time to move out of this place. Like, for me, I could have stayed in Ottawa when COVID happened, and I'd be like, okay, like I'm fine here, still got my buddies, but like sometimes it takes things to happen in the universe. Like now I'm in Newfoundland, I'm like, okay, cool, but then you've got friends up away that moved back home. I'm like, okay, this is really the test now of friendship of like, how close were we? But like, have you had that moment when you went from, I guess, Nashville to Newfoundland where it's like you kind of reconnected with some people, but at the same point you're like, oh my God, like I haven't talked to this person in a while. Like, can we still reconnect? Like, is there like a window of like, hey, you didn't contact me in like 3 years? Like, it's almost like when someone borrows something for you, and if they don't give it back within a year, it's technically yours.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I kind of split my time between Nashville and Newfoundland anyway. Like usually when I'm in Newfoundland, I know the date I'm going back to Nashville and vice versa. Okay. So I don't get to really miss people too much because I know it's not going to be that long when I see them next. But I definitely, when COVID happened, I was only supposed to be in Newfoundland from like, well, only a couple weeks in March because I was supposed to go on tour. I was supposed to tour the arts and culture centers. And then I was supposed to do a cross-country tour. I was supposed to go to BC and back on a radio tour. Of course, as soon as I landed, everything got canned. And Newfoundland was doing a lot better than the States was with COVID cases. So I was like, well, I'm just going to stay here and ride this thing out as long as possible. So I ended up being in Newfoundland from March to the beginning of November.
Okay.
And so I was able to like I obviously spent a lot more time with friends, and I got to collaborate a lot more with a lot of local musicians and local artists. And it was just really fun. I just grew closer to a lot of my friends here that I normally wouldn't have seen otherwise, because every time I come home, it's like, no, I have to spend time with my family. I have to spend time with my goddaughter. I have to see, my best friend. So it's like, you come home to relax, but you don't relax because almost every hour of every day is designated. You don't get the chance to just be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to pop up on George Street and go see so-and-so, So it was really nice to kind of strengthen some of those friendships that I don't think I would have had a chance to.
Must be super nice to have friends. I come.
Hi, friend. I'll be your friend.
That's going to do it for this episode of Tobin Tonight. Our thanks to Mallory Johnson for coming on to the show. Remember, you can find past, present, and future episodes on TobinTonight.com, Spotify, and iTunes. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and leave a comment or two. For Tobin and myself, this is Jacob saying thank you for listening, and good night.